Trump pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, barely furnished beyond a single hospital bed and a metal chair. A frail woman sat upright in the bed, her gray hair tied back loosely. Deep lines etched into her face. Sarah Collins, once a senior administrator at Ironwood Veterans Hospital, looked up, her sharp eyes studying Trump before she spoke. "I knew someone would come eventually," she said, her voice hoarse. "Didn't expect it to be you." Trump pulled up the chair, sitting down across from her. "Tell me what's going on here," he said, his tone even but firm. Sarah let out a slow, tired breath. "It's worse than you think," she murmured. Ironwood was supposed to be a sanctuary for veterans, but it became something else. The funding, millions of dollars, vanished. Equipment never arrived, medications went missing, and every time someone tried to speak up, they were removed. Trump's gaze darkened. Removed how? Sarah hesitated. Some fired, some transferred without warning, and then there's the ones who just disappeared, patients and staff alike. No explanations, no records. The air in the room felt heavier. Trump leaned forward. "Who's behind this?" Sarah's eyes flickered toward the window. "You don't understand. It's not just one person. It's a system. Politicians, administrators, corporations. They bleed these hospitals dry and then leave the people who need them most to rot." Trump clenched his jaw. "Names. I need names." Sarah hesitated, then reached under her pillow, pulling out a worn, leather-bound notebook. "I wrote down everything I could before they forced me out," she said. "Who was involved, where the money went. It's all here." Trump took the notebook, flipping through its pages. Names, bank transfers, signed documents, everything laid out like a blueprint of corruption. "You need to be careful," Sarah warned. "The people running this? They won't let you just walk away with that." Trump's grip on the notebook tightened. "Let them try." But before he could say another word, a loud knock echoed through the hallway. Heavy footsteps followed. Sarah's face paled. "They know you're here." Trump stood up, sliding the notebook into the inside pocket of his coat. "Don't worry about me," he said. "Just stay safe." The door burst open. Two large men in suits stepped in, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Trump," one of them said, his voice too polite to be genuine. "You need to leave. Now." Trump turned to them, unfazed. "I was just leaving." He stepped past them, his mind already racing through his next move. He had what he needed. But Sarah was right. This was bigger than just one corrupt hospital. This was an entire machine. And if he wanted to take it down, he'd need to do more than just expose it. He needed to bring it to its knees. The fallout. By the time Trump left Ironwood, his mind was set. He wasn't going to let this slide. The next morning, he called a press conference. No vague statements, no empty promises, just cold, hard truth. The corruption in our veterans' healthcare system is beyond unacceptable, it's criminal. Trump announced. And I have proof. Millions of dollars have been stolen. Lives have been lost. This is a betrayal of our heroes. And it ends now. He held up Sarah's notebook. "I have names. I have documents. And I promise you this. Every single person involved is going to be held accountable." The media erupted. Networks scrambled to cover the story. Some tried to spin it, calling it a political stunt. But the evidence was undeniable. Whistleblowers started coming forward. More hospitals were implicated. Congress was forced to open an investigation. And behind closed doors, the people who had been pulling the strings for years started to panic. One by one, the names in Sarah's notebook found themselves under scrutiny. Bank accounts were frozen. Arrests were made. The machine was crumbling. And as for Trump, he had done what he always promised. He fought for the people who had been forgotten. He fought for the ones who had given everything for their country, only to be abandoned. And this time, he wasn't stopping until justice was served. Exhale, his jaw tightening. Richard Hale, a man who had escaped justice once. But not this time. Trump turned back to the nurse. Where would Marcus Bellamy go if he was in danger? She hesitated, then whispered, "There's a shelter on the south side of town. St. Jude's. He used to volunteer there. If he's still in the city, that's where he'd be." Trump gave her a firm nod, then strode toward the exit. He could feel the weight of Sarah Collins' words pressing on him. This wasn't just corruption, this was something deeper. Something designed to break the very people who had given everything for their country. As he stepped outside, the cold wind biting against his face, his phone buzzed. It was his aide. We have a problem, sir. Trump's grip on the phone tightened. Go on. Marcus Bellamy is missing. No paper trail. No credit card activity. No digital footprint. It's like he vanished into thin air. Trump clenched his jaw. Find him. And keep digging into Hale. I don't care what it takes. Yes, sir. Trump ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He glanced up at the hospital one last time, his expression unreadable. Then he got into the waiting SUV. St. Jude's, he told the driver. The battle unfolds. The shelter was on the outskirts of town. A modest brick building with flickering streetlights casting long shadows against its walls. Trump stepped out, his presence immediately drawing wary glances from those huddled under blankets near the entrance. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Volunteers moved between the rows of cots, offering blankets, food, and quiet reassurances. Trump approached the front desk, where an older woman sat typing. She looked up and did a double take. "Mr. Trump?" she asked. Stunned. "I need to find Marcus Bellamy," he said, cutting straight to the point. Her expression darkened. She glanced over her shoulder, then motioned for him to follow. They moved through a dimly lit hallway until she stopped in front of a small storage room. She knocked twice, then cracked the door open. "Marcus," she said softly, "you have a visitor." A man stepped forward, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He looked tired, wary. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes sunken. Trump didn't hesitate. "We need to talk." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but not here." They moved to a back room where the shelter stored medical supplies. Marcus shut the door behind them, leaning against it with a heavy sigh. "I know why you're here," he said quietly. "Then start talking," Trump replied. Marcus ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "You have no idea how deep this goes. Ironwood isn't just about corruption. It's a front, a way to funnel government money into private accounts. Veterans? They're just collateral damage." Trump's expression darkened. "Who's behind it?" Marcus exhaled sharply. "Richard Hale is just a pawn. The real power is higher up. Senators, CEOs, even people inside the Pentagon. They've built an entire network that profits off the suffering of veterans. They control the hospitals, the contracts, even the pharmaceutical supply chain. Anyone who gets in their way disappears." Trump's fingers curled into fists. "They think they're untouchable." Marcus gave a bitter laugh. "Because they are. You expose one, two more take their place. The system is built to protect them." Trump shook his head. "Not this time." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" Trump pulled out Sarah Collins' notebook and placed it on the table. "I have names, records, transactions. We take this public. We make it impossible for them to hide." Marcus hesitated. "You don't understand. They'll come for you. They'll come for me." Trump's eyes burned with determination. "Let them try. The war begins." The next morning, Trump stood behind a podium. Cameras flashing, microphones positioned in front of him. "Ironwood Veterans Hospital is just the beginning," he declared. "We have uncovered evidence of one of the largest corruption scandals in American history, one that preys on the very men and women who fought to protect this country." He held up Sarah's notebook. "This is the proof. This is the truth. And I promise you this. Every single person responsible will face justice." The media exploded. Networks scrambled to cover the story. Officials who once stood silent began distancing themselves from the scandal. But the people behind the corruption weren't going down without a fight. Threats were issued. Attempts were made to discredit the whistleblowers. But the American people weren't buying it. The evidence was too damning. And then, the real reckoning began. A Senate investigation was launched. Richard Hale was arrested. His offshore accounts exposed. Other high-ranking officials were subpoenaed. The machine that had operated in darkness for years was finally being dragged into the light. And at the center of it all stood Trump. Unwavering, relentless. Him either disappears or is silenced. Sarah Collins tried to warn people. "I tried to stop it. And look where that got me." Trump's eyes burned with quiet fury. "Where's the proof?" Bellamy motioned toward the papers scattered across the table. "Everything's there. Transactions, internal emails, patient records that were altered or erased altogether. Veterans who were supposed to receive life-saving treatments never did." Trump picked up one of the documents, his sharp gaze moving over the numbers. Millions siphoned. Names scrubbed from hospital records. Medication orders that led nowhere. This wasn't just fraud. It was a crime against those who had given everything for their country. Bellamy's voice was low, urgent. Hale isn't working alone. He's protected. If you take him down, others will come after you. They don't just bury the evidence, they bury people. Trump set the document down and met Bellamy's tired but determined gaze. Let them try. Bellamy studied him for a moment, searching for any hesitation. He found none. Slowly, he nodded. All right, but if we're going to take them down, we need to do it right. The plan. By morning, Trump's team had moved swiftly. His aides worked behind the scenes, compiling everything Bellamy had given them. Meanwhile, Trump made a phone call to someone who could ensure this wouldn't be buried, a top-ranking senator who still had a spine. I need you to get this in front of the right people, Trump said, his voice like steel. The senator hesitated. Do you have proof? Enough to bring down everyone involved. Silence. Then a quiet, resolute reply. Then let's move. Trump knew this wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about forcing the media, the politicians, and the entire nation to confront the reality of what had been happening under their noses. And if there was one thing Trump understood, it was how to control the narrative. Within 24 hours, the bombshell report hit the press. The reckoning. News outlets scrambled to cover it. Headlines exploded across every major network. Millions stolen from veterans, government officials implicated. Hospital director accused of selling medical equipment on black market. Trump exposes VA scandal. Who's protecting the corrupt? The American people were outraged. Veterans organizations demanded immediate action. Protesters gathered outside Ironwood Veterans Hospital, calling for Richard Hale's arrest. And in Washington, politicians who had once ignored the whispers of corruption now rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. Trump wasn't done. Standing before a podium, he addressed the nation. Our veterans fought for this country. They sacrificed. And what did they get in return? A system that left them to die while corrupt officials lined their pockets. Well, I have news for them. This ends today. The crowd erupted in cheers. And to the people behind this, let me make one thing clear. You can't hide anymore. The American people know the truth. And I promise you, we will not stop until every single one of you faces justice. The fallout. Within days, Richard Hale was arrested. His offshore accounts were frozen. Investigators uncovered a vast network of corruption stretching beyond Ironwood, government contractors, medical suppliers, even high-ranking officials inside the VA were implicated. More arrests followed. Senate hearings were launched. Whistleblowers stepped forward. The system that had protected these criminals for years was finally crumbling. And Marcus Bellamy? With his name cleared, he returned to the work he loved, treating veterans, ensuring they received the care they deserved. He stood side by side with Trump as reforms were introduced, his voice no longer silenced. Before Hale could respond, the office door burst open. A group of federal agents stormed in, their badges gleaming under the sterile fluorescent lights. The lead agent, a man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. Richard Hale, he announced, his voice echoing through the office. You are under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. Please stand up and place your hands where we can see them. For the first time, the smug confidence drained from Hale's face. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to lie, but no words came. The weight of the moment crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Trump didn't move, didn't blink. He simply watched as justice began to unfold. Hale's hands trembled as he slowly pushed himself up from his chair. You have no idea who you're messing with. He spat, his voice laced with desperate arrogance. Trump raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. No, Hale, he said, his voice calm but razor sharp. You have no idea what happens when someone finally fights back. The agents moved in, securing Hale's wrists with handcuffs. As they read him his rights, Bellamy exhaled, his body visibly shaking. For months, he had lived in fear, looking over his shoulder, wondering if his next breath would be his last. But tonight, the nightmare was ending. As Hale was led out of the office, Trump turned to Bellamy. You did good, he said. Bellamy let out a shaky breath, nodding. I couldn't have done it alone. Trump gave him a firm pat on the shoulder. No one fights alone, not anymore. The fallout. By the next morning, the news had exploded across every major outlet. VA hospital scandal. Millions stolen. Director arrested. Trump and whistleblower expose massive corruption. Veterans left to die while officials profited. The investigation begins. The American people were outraged. Veterans organizations demanded further investigation into the VA system. Politicians who had once ignored the whispers of corruption now scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Within a week, multiple arrests followed. The network of corruption stretched further than anyone had anticipated. Doctors, hospital administrators, government contractors. Some fled, others turned on each other, desperate to save themselves. Trump, however, wasn't finished. Standing at a podium before a massive crowd, he addressed the nation. This was never about politics. This was about the men and women who gave everything for this country. They deserve more than empty promises. They deserve action. And I promise you this, we will not stop until every corrupt official, every fraudster who has preyed on our veterans, is held accountable. The crowd erupted into cheers, chanting his name. And to those who think they can hide, who think they can keep stealing from the American people, your time is up. The legacy. In the weeks that followed, new policies were introduced to overhaul the Veterans Affairs system. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, funding mismanagement was aggressively targeted, and the people responsible for the suffering at Ironwood Veterans Hospital faced real consequences. Marcus Bellamy? With his name cleared, he returned to his work, treating the very veterans who had once been abandoned. He became an advocate, a voice for those who had none, ensuring that what happened at Ironwood would never happen again. Sarah Collins, the woman who had risked everything to send that anonymous letter. She was given the recognition she deserved, a Congressional Medal of Honor for her bravery in exposing the truth. And Trump? He walked away knowing that, for once, the system had been forced to answer for its sins. That justice, though long delayed, had finally arrived. But he also knew this: corruption never sleeps. And as long as it existed, so would the fight. The reckoning. A team of FBI agents swarmed into the room, their presence suffocating. One of them stepped forward, holding up an arrest warrant. Richard Hale, you are under arrest for embezzlement of federal funds, financial fraud, and gross misconduct. Hale's face drained of color. He shot up from his chair, eyes darting toward the door. But he barely made it a step before two agents grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back. No, no, Hale thrashed as the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. You can't do this. I have connections. I have protection. I'm not going to prison. Trump stared him down, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Tell that to the veterans who died because of you, he said coldly. See if they believe you. Hale's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. Marcus Bellamy let out a shaky breath as if he'd been holding it for years. He turned to Trump, his voice almost disbelieving. It's over. Trump met his gaze. This is just the beginning, he said. There's a lot more work to do. Bellamy nodded, but this time, there was hope in his eyes. For the first time in years, he believed that justice was possible. Trump turned, looking out toward the hospital corridor where elderly veterans sat waiting for care, waiting for someone to fight for them. They wouldn't have to wait much longer. The battle had ended, but the war to restore honor and dignity to those who had served was far from over. And Donald Trump was ready to lead the charge. The aftermath. 3 months after Richard Hale's arrest, Ironwood Veterans Hospital was unrecognizable. The once dark, mold-ridden hallways had been cleaned, repainted, and restored. The stench of decay had been replaced with the crisp scent of fresh disinfectant. Veterans no longer sat for hours, waiting endlessly for care. Medicine was fully stocked. Doctors and nurses had returned, real healers, not those who had looked the other way. And most importantly, the corruption that had thrived in the shadows had been ripped out at its roots. Standing at the entrance of the hospital, Donald Trump silently observed. There were no crowds, no applause, no speeches. He didn't need them. This was the only victory that mattered. Marcus Bellamy approached him, a thick file in hand. No longer a fugitive, no longer a man living in fear. He was back where he belonged. He extended the file to Trump. All the missing funds have been recovered, Bellamy reported. The government has agreed to increase funding for veterans' health care. And most importantly, People like Richard Hale will never have the chance to do this again. Trump nodded, flipping through the pages. He had fought many battles, on the political stage, in business, against enemies both foreign and domestic. But this was one of the most meaningful. A familiar figure stepped forward, Sarah Collins, the woman who had started it all with her anonymous letter. She looked stronger now, no longer trapped in a hospital room, no longer drowning in despair. But her eyes still carried the weight of someone who had seen too much injustice in her lifetime. She met Trump's gaze. "I used to believe no one cared about us," she admitted, "that after everything we had done, after everything we had sacrificed, we were just forgotten." Her voice faltered for a moment. "But I was wrong." Trump placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his voice steady and sure. "No one who has fought for this country should ever be forgotten." For the first time in years, Sarah Collins smiled, a real, genuine smile, as Trump walked out of the hospital. The golden sunlight cut through the cold morning air, washing away the shadows of the past. But he knew this battle wasn't over. The system still had cracks. There would always be another Richard Hale, waiting for the chance to exploit it. But there was something far more powerful than corruption, the truth. And no matter how deep someone tried to bury it, no matter how much power they held, the truth always finds its way to the surface. And as long as Donald Trump was standing, he would never stop fighting to make sure of that. The story of Trump's battle against corruption at Ironwood Veterans Hospital teaches us a crucial lesson. The fight for justice is never over. And silence is the ally of corruption. In today's world, too many people look the other way, afraid to challenge those in power. But real change doesn't come from waiting for someone else to fix the problem. It comes from standing up, speaking out, and refusing to accept injustice. Whether in politics, business, or daily life, we must never be afraid to fight for what is right, because the truth, no matter how buried, will always rise.